Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And I don't know about you, but I often find myself overhearing discussions about historical periods and people, most frequently medieval and early modern. And in some cases, one of the following arguably dismissive phrases will pop up. So I might hear someone say, well, they couldn't read or write. They were all illiterate. So and so couldn't even sign their own name, and so on. Now, this is certainly not meant to be an attack on anyone who has ever said any of these things, because it has been an overriding part of the historical narrative for so long. Our silly ancestors who didn't know better and couldn't read or write. This is one of the reasons that many scholars of the medieval period prefer to avoid calling it the Dark Ages, which is a term that is credited to the 14th century Italian scholar Petrarch, and was ultimately based on his frankly questionable position that literature and learning suffered a period of stagnation, if not decline, in the time between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. In fact, Renaissance is another term that many scholars tend to avoid using for the period beginning in around 1400. They prefer to call it instead the early modern period. I do have a video on the way that we have chosen to divide up history that I will be leaving linked. In today's video, we're going to look at some examples of historical education in action. In addition, we'll be touching a bit more broadly on information exchange, and we'll also be examining perceptions, or perhaps more properly, myths of intelligence. Let's go. I was inspired to make this video because I was sent this amazing product. It's called the OrCam Read, and the company that makes this kindly reached out to me after seeing my video about my experiences of having dyslexia. I am going to show this off properly later in the video, but it's designed to assist people who find reading text a challenge, for whatever reason. Receiving this got me thinking about the place of reading in the time I live in. When we use the term literacy or literate today, or for that matter, illiterate, I think we have a very clear idea of what that refers to. Namely, that a person is able to both read and write in order to be literate. It is, for us, I think, almost as if one skill is unable to be present in a person without the other one being there. And while I do concede that that is probably the case for writing, I think one needs to be able to read in order to write, I'm not sure if we can say the same is true for reading. For example, when we look at individuals from the past and we can find no evidence of them being able to write, or indeed a clear sign that they were not unable to write, that will often lead us to an assumption that they must have been illiterate. But they may very well have been able to read, because it's just quite hard to find evidence of someone having that particular skill and using it. Additionally, as we're about to see later in this video, having the skill of reading is certainly not the only way to absorb information. And equally, a person doesn't need to be able to write in order to transmit information. I'm never sure how I feel about that famous phrase, the past is another country, they do things differently there. But in the case of what literacy actually meant and means then and now, and in conjunction, how knowledge was transmitted, information exchanged, and skills gained, I do think we might have to check our modern understanding at the door. Another notion that I should probably flag up as being questionable is the idea that there was an explosion of literacy immediately following the construction of Johannes Gutenberg's printing press in the middle of the 15th century. Also, this was not anywhere near being the first printing press, despite frequently getting the credit. There is, I think, an idea that what came next, almost overnight, was the birth of the Renaissance. That suddenly books just started flying out of printing houses in a way that democratised learning and spread literacy. Undeniably, printing would certainly come to be the technology that would offer all of this, but it would take centuries for it to be fully realised. At the start, and for a number of years, printed books were produced in comparatively small print runs, and fair copies especially, but all books to a certain extent, continued to be costly commodities, although they would have cost less than the richly illuminated and gilded manuscripts that were still being produced in the monastic copyhouses of Europe. There were options as well for less expensive printed texts that came in the form of chapbooks and broadsides. These were made up of fewer pages, and they usually required just the most rudimentary of bindings or no binding at all. I don't see how it's possible to do anything much more than guess about levels of literacy that existed among our ancestors, especially if we choose to take that term to mean the capacity to read. I mean, when we think about it, we might also want to ask how well or how much you would need to be able to read in order to be considered literate, both in your own time and maybe also for us now. I mean, does it mean being able to read and comprehend Gutenberg's Latin Bible? Is it sufficient instead to just be able to sing along with a bit of doggerel English that you found printed on a broadside? In either case, if you want to enjoy the significant increase in available reading matter coming onto the marketplace, you're going to have to wait until around the middle of the 17th century. And prior to that, most people would have to either be or know someone who was lucky enough to have been able to amass a personal library, if they were going to have access to anything that approximated a library or text collection as we might recognise it. But what about the education of children? Well, for those who could afford to lose a pair of hands in the field or the pinner's workshop, or indeed whatever other industry put food on the family table, clothes on their backs, and a roof over their heads, ultimately, the type of education your child would receive depended upon what you could afford, and or potentially what was most fashionable for your particular class. For the sons of comfortable to affluent but not noble households, such as perhaps a maker of gloves, maybe even fine gloves, living in Stratford upon Avon, someone who could do without their child's labour in their workshop, for those children, the schoolroom beckoned. We are talking about William Shakespeare and his educational path, or at least what we know of it. Peter Holland explains that young William would have first attended a petty school. He would have gone there from about the age of 5 to around 7. It was here that he would have been taught to read. But this learning, we think, may have been supplemented by additional instruction from William's own mother, whose literacy, or at least her ability to read, has been argued for on the basis of her being able to act as the executor of her own father's will. After petty school, William moved on to Stratford's King's New School, a grammar school, and this was free for all of the boys in the borough to be able to attend. Grammar schools get their name from their reliance on grammar books as an educational tool. The pupil's education was grounded in the study of Latin, both written and spoken. These Latin texts are believed to have included, in Shakespeare's case, Livy's History, Cicero's speeches, comedies by Plautus and Terence, Seneca's tragedies, and the poetry of Virgil and Ovid. The intention was to ensure that by the time Shakespeare and his schoolmates left their grammar school at around 14 or 15, they were equipped with a capacity for memorising, a facility in composition, and rhetorical skills. Although there is no evidence of there being a plan for William Shakespeare to ever attend university, that would have been the path for some grammar school boys, and maybe even a few of William's own classmates. For the others, the path would have been for them to enter into apprenticeships where they would hope to learn a trade that would allow them to provide well for their own families in the future. If we go back to around a century before Shakespeare's school days, we can see the grammar school to university story play out for the son of an Ipswich butcher, albeit it is a rather fast-track story, because Thomas, the son, seems to have been something of a prodigy. because he was ready to move on from his grammar school early enough for him to graduate with his BA from Magdalen in Oxford when he was just 15. He did this in 1486. And while it wasn't unknown for students to enter the universities as young as 12, by the 1500s the average age was 15. So Thomas was finishing when most of his age would have just been starting. It's thought that Thomas's education may have been funded by his maternal uncle. From his BA, his studies continued. He would be ordained a priest, he would obtain his MA, and he would also occupy a few roles within the field of education. This education, plus his seemingly precocious intellect, would set him up for a glittering but ultimately doomed career as the chief advisor to King Henry VIII, because the boy Thomas would become Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Thomas Wolsey's university experience would have been markedly different from what we recognise today, particularly when it comes to assessment, but also the courses. There would be some more study of grammar, logic and rhetoric, but also some combination of philosophy, poetics, history, music, arithmetic, geometry and astronomy, all of which were intended to qualify a person for the degrees of bachelor and then master. The masters would be the ones who would teach those who followed on behind them. Some masters would proceed on to more advanced studies where they would become doctors of divinity or of canon and civil law, and more occasionally of medicine. But there were no written exams, there was no coursework to be marked. Fitness to proceed or complete was determined by verbal rather than written means. Oral disputations were the order of the day. So, for example, a candidate looking to obtain their BA, their bachelor's, would put forward a series of ideas, questions, or theses to be disputed or debated with first their fellow students and then the masters who had taught them. Those who sought to become doctors would face a similar challenge from those who had passed through the doctorate before they had. There is an echo of this practice that still exists in the university. For those who've undertaken doctoral studies, there is the viva. This Latin term refers to in viva voce, or in the living voice, and it's where a doctoral candidate will submit their full doctoral thesis to their examiners. And in my experience, being in the UK system, there will be two examiners. One will be from your institution, they are your internal examiner, and one will be from elsewhere. They will be selected because they are particular experts in your field. They are invited to come and be your external examiner. At a given date, you will be called in for your viva, and your examiners will expect you to defend your full thesis orally. They want to ensure that you are legitimately the author, and they also want you to be able to give evidence as to why what you have done is a genuine and original contribution to knowledge. They also are going to look for you to be able to clarify, discuss, and defend any or all of the points that you have made. So in many ways, I think it's probably very like the medieval and early modern university disputations, except there is also the addition of there being 100,000 words for me to write and for my examiners to read. Being completely honest, there were a number of times that I wished I could just have done the historical version. And I do now put that down to my dyslexia. But of course, I did know this to have been a forlorn hope, not only because humanity is making very slow progress on the old time machine, but also because, as I am a woman, those universities would not have let me through the doors in the first place. In fact, the nature of female education for girls and women at this level of society is much more obscured when we compare it to that of their male counterparts, and in large part I think that's because the grammar schools and universities weren't open to women and girls. Nevertheless, it is hard for me to see how a girl whose future was likely to involve managing a household, servants, and perhaps, if her husband was away or even deceased, the business that was meant to provide for her family, it's hard for me to see how that girl would be allowed to progress or how it would be able to be thought that she'd be able to get by without at least some education. I mean, she's certainly going to need the skills to run the household, and that may include, depending on its size, any or all of the following. She might be hiring and managing the staff, furnishing the rooms, dressing the family, ordering, producing, and keeping on top of the stocks of food and drink for the entire household. Now, if she was also able to support or stand in for her husband, then it's going to be useful and certainly, I would argue, necessary for her to be sufficiently numerate to understand what she's looking at when dealing with both the household and business accounts. By the 16th century, the fashion for double-entry bookkeeping was in full swing in England. This system was being used on the continent, specifically in Venice, from as early as 1300. It's thought that the Venetians may have borrowed the technique from the Islamic world, or indeed from India, where there is evidence that hints at this form of money management dating back thousands of years. Alternatively, it's been suggested that the Venetians may have invented the system themselves to make commercial use of Arabic numerals, which in many ways are superior to the previously used Roman numerals, as they do give the bookkeeper the option to log nothing, to use the numeric 0. Also, it has been argued, as we saw in the example of William Shakespeare's mother, that women from all levels of society may frequently have been the first educators of their children, or at least a supplementary educator of their children. And this was true of both their sons and their daughters. So I think when a man goes in search of a wife, it might be a valuable thing to a future husband, the future father of children, if he knew that his daughter's learning was in safe hands, and if he knew that his sons would be able to attend their first classes at grammar school, or if they were noble, with their private tutor, with at least some rudimentary skills with letters and maybe numbers. That, I think, would be a worthwhile skill to have in a wife. As I said a moment ago, the place of a mother as her child's first teacher seems to be something that exists across the social divide, even potentially reaching as high up as the royal family. Because an exploration of the extant handwriting examples of Henry VIII and of his mother, Elizabeth of York, is thought by some scholars to show evidence of a shared quirk in handwriting. And it's a quirk that is not present in the handwritings of Henry's known tutors. This has resulted in the suggestion that it was Elizabeth who taught her son to write, that she was there teaching him before his tutors even got involved. For the nobility and royalty of Tudor England, tutors were frequently employed. On occasion, a host of noble children would be educated together by the same tutor or tutors, almost like a schoolroom. Sometimes these would be siblings, but on other occasions, the children collected together would be there to be companions of a higher-born child. The example of Prince Edward, who becomes King Edward VI, is an interesting one in this regard. The respected scholar Dr. Richard Cox was named as an officer of Edward's household in March 1539, but he would double as Edward's tutor from 1540, at which point the young prince was not yet 3 years old. Then, in July 1543, Edward gets a new stepmother, Catherine Parr, who is said to have taken a very keen interest in his ongoing education. Certainly, Edward would write to her, and he would address her as Mater Charissima, or Mater Carissima, however you choose to pronounce it, meaning my dearest mother. And then he would go on to express his gratitude for her encouragement of him in his learning. When Henry VIII mounted his invasion of France in 1544, he left Catherine as his regent in England, and among her many other roles, he also gave her the oversight for Prince Edward's household. That household included a new tutor that Henry had selected, because now Richard Cox was supported by John Cheek, or Cheek, Regius Professor of Greek at Cambridge. Henry had determined that Edward would not be alone in his classroom. Dale Hoke explains that at various points as both prince and then king, Edward's schoolmates were, quote, his cousins Edward and Henry Seymour, Hertford's sons, Henry Sidney, whose father William was successively chamberlain and steward of the prince's household, John, Lord Lumley, Henry, Lord Strange, son and heir of the 3rd Earl of Derby, Henry, Lord Hastings, afterwards 3rd Earl of Huntingdon, James Butler, 10th Earl of Ormond, Henry and Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk's sons, whose deaths in an epidemic in 1551 are said to have affected Edward greatly, and the prince's favourite, Barnaby Fitzpatrick, eldest son of the Baron of Upper Ossory, with whom Edward shared an affectionate correspondence in his last years. Prince Edward was taught in the fashionable humanist way, the way that had been promoted by such scholars as Erasmus and Juan Luis Vives. Dr. Cox would claim that Edward had committed to memory almost 4 books of Cato, Aesop's Fables, Things of the Bible, and Vives' own Satellitium. This was by January of 1546. Edward would turn 9 later that year, in the October. In the early modern humanist education, the study of Greek and Roman writing supported a curriculum that would, it was believed, teach Edward to be a virtuous Christian prince, one who was wise and well versed in rhetoric, languages, philosophy, history, and whatever else was thought best to support his future kingship. Because the humanist education focused on educating the individual. Education by tutor was not, however, the sole preserve of elite males in this time. Sir or Saint Thomas More, depending on your political and or faith standpoint, has been elevated as a kind of proto-feminist due to the equality of educational opportunities that existed in his own household. More saw to it that his daughters were educated alongside his son, and his eldest daughter, who is said to have been his favourite child, is famed for her intellectual capacity and achievement. In fact, I'm thinking that I probably need to do a video about her for this channel. But here's a quick rundown. Margaret More, later Margaret Roper, is said to have learned to read at around 3. Reportedly, she used Aesop's Fables to do so, and she was taught by her father. But when the demands of court drew her father from home more regularly, he chose to employ a tutor to minister to all of his children. Under this tutor, Margaret studied Latin, Greek, astronomy, philosophy, theology, geometry, and arithmetic. In recognition of her learning, Erasmus himself would dedicate his commentary on the Christian hymn of Prudentius to Margaret. She would respond by translating one of Erasmus's texts, which was ultimately published as a devout treatise upon the Paternoster in 1525. At this point, Margaret was only 20 years old. However, before I go on and end up further canonising her father for his promotion of the equality of the sexes, it bears remembering that when Margaret was about to give birth to her first child in 1523, her father Thomas wrote to her and included the following lines, quote, "We pray most earnestly that all may go happily and successfully with you. May God and our Blessed Lady grant you happily and safely to increase your family by a little one, like to his mother in everything except sex. Yet let it by all means be a girl, if only she will make up for the inferiority of her sex by her zeal to imitate her mother's virtue and learning. Such a girl I should prefer to 3 boys." Talk about being damned by faint praise. As it was, Margaret's baby would be a girl, named Elizabeth. Speaking of Elizabeths, Thomas More wasn't the only one who was willing to educate his daughters, because the king was too. It may seem odd, considering how unfit Henry thought women were for ruling, that he allowed both of his daughters to benefit from a frankly princely education. In addition to the courtly arts of decorous behaviour, music making, singing, dancing, horse riding, and other fashionable gameplay, Mary and Elizabeth were both placed in the hands of famed scholars for their tutelage. And we can certainly see evidence of that tutelage in a couple of things produced by Elizabeth. There is a clear example of the progression of Elizabeth's skill with languages and also penwomanship through the gifts that she gives on 2 successive New Year's Eves. During 1544, the 11-year-old Elizabeth worked on an English translation of Marguerite of Navarre's French meditational poem, The Mirror or Glass of the Sinful Soul. And she gifts this translation to Catherine Parr. It's bound with an embroidered cover that some think was crafted by Elizabeth herself. The text opens with a letter from Elizabeth to the recipient, and we can see in this image of the text that's now held by the Bodleian Library that despite the clear care that she has taken over working neatly, Elizabeth has had to make a correction. She's had to add in the word princess above the line so that it will read, not only knowing the affectious will and fervent zeal the which your highness hath towards all godly learning, and also my duty towards you, most gracious and sovereign princess. The next year, on New Year's Eve 1545, the now 12-year-old Elizabeth presents her father with this. Once again, we are seeing an embroidered binding. This one includes the interlocked initials of Henry VIII and Catherine Parr, and in the corners of the cover are the white roses of Elizabeth's grandmother and namesake, Elizabeth of York. There are some who suggest that this embroidered binding may have been produced by a professional, but the text contained within it, however, is all Elizabeth. This 12-year-old girl has translated her stepmother's work, prayers and meditations, from English into Latin, French, and Italian. This time, the letter to the recipient, her father, has been produced in Latin rather than English. Not only is this the gift of remarkably developed linguistic complexity and proficiency, but it also shows us clearly just how much Elizabeth's control over the quill has come on in the space of a year. The italic hand is flawless and really well spaced across the vellum. I think it's worth mentioning that in later life, Elizabeth, and indeed many others who were sufficiently affluent, would have no need for such proficiency and neatness in handwriting. In fact, in later life, Elizabeth herself apologises in some of her missives for these scribbled lines or her scribbling in haste. It looks like her hand has deteriorated, presumably with age perhaps, or maybe just from lack of practice. The fashionable, or at least dominant, form of handwriting during the early modern period is known as secretary hand. This name comes from the fact that much of the work of writing was done by professional copyists, and they were known as secretaries, clerks, scriveners, or scribes. They could be paid to turn a person's scribblings, or even dictation, into a stylish, legible, handwritten text, or at least, presumably, legible for the time, because secretary hand is notoriously difficult to read today. But either way, these people allowed those who could afford their services, whether on a temporary or permanent basis, to be able to leave a written record, even if that record was not in their own hand. And whether this choice to not use their own hand was due to an inability to write or just a preference not to, will, of course, differ from case to case. Here we have one side of that literacy equation being solved, though, don't we? So what about the other side? What about reading? As I mentioned earlier, I think it's fairly difficult to offer any firm or hard idea about how many people in early modern England could read, as it's simply not a skill that leaves traces on its own account. And then the issue is made even more complicated because we have to ask what an ability to read in this period might also entail or mean. So, could you read in English? Okay, perfect, you can. Well, if you can, what about the other texts that are available, printed and handwritten, the ones in Greek or Latin or French, Italian, Spanish, etc.? Also, what happens if you were once taught to read, but age, disease, or even injury has now caused damage to your vision, leaving you unable to read? Well, I'd argue that all it takes is for there to be one person in the household, or perhaps just the local community, who is able and willing to read aloud for other people to be able to consume and understand written text. Additionally, just as there were professional writers, there were also professional readers, like Gabriel Harvey. Harvey was befriended and patronised by such illustrious figures as Edmund Spenser, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and Sir Thomas Smith. I do have a video on Sir Thomas Smith and his contributions to England that I am going to be leaving linked. The task of the professional reader was to comprehend material, link it to other ideas, and then formulate further arguments out of it. They would usually be tasked by their employers with seeking out appropriate material to prove an argument their employer wished to make, and or to aid their employer's understanding of any given topic. Now, I'm often asked if I can think of any early modern people who were dyslexic, like I am, and the short answer is no. And in part, that's probably because no one is looking to diagnose a person with dyslexia during this period. But I also can't think of anybody who I would potentially retrospectively diagnose with dyslexia. And I think that's in part because of the fact that spelling isn't standardised. So all those telltale written spelling errors that frequently give me away as a dyslexic are and were perfectly within the bounds of both acceptable and legible writing for the time. Additionally, what further complicates it is they had their own workarounds. They had their own form of assistive technology. This was, of course, other people, and they were the amateur helpers or paid professionals. People who wrote or read for their families and communities, or for their employers. All of which leads in seamlessly, I'd argue, to me getting to show off this really cool product that I was sent, that inspired me to make this video. This is the OrCam Read, and it's designed to assist people with reading printed text. I have talked about this before, but I was diagnosed with dyslexia at the start of my doctoral studies. And part of how dyslexia manifests for me is that I find taking in and retaining information from printed texts really challenging. So I'll be honest, I got pretty excited when I found out just how powerful the OrCam Read is, considering how small it is. Because back when I got diagnosed and I was first able to get a hold of assistive equipment to help me, I needed a physical printed text, a whole scanner, and also a computer to achieve actually a little less support than what the OrCam Read offers. Because the OrCam Read can read from a book, a printed piece of paper, but also, incredibly helpfully, directly from a screen. With the added bonus being that this will fit in your bag or even in your pocket. So when you get in front of the text you want to read, you hold down this button, you point the device at your text, you release, and you listen. Now, if you are out and about and you don't want everyone to overhear what you're reading, there is a headphone jack. So you've got the privacy there. And staying on that privacy angle, the OrCam Read is completely offline. There's no internet connection. So you know that you're going to be safe to use this even on the most sensitive of documents. I'm going to take the headphones out now so that I can show you this more properly in action. And I'm going to also say that this is an absolutely fabulous bit of scholarship. But I did find my first read of this quite challenging because the text has not been laid out in a particularly dyslexia-friendly way. And perhaps you can see what I mean by that. We've got small font, really narrow margins, and the lines are super close together. And all of that, for me at least, makes line tracking pretty tough. But I've been using the OrCam Read to reread this text, and it's just been a real game changer. So just watch this. So I'm pushing down the button and my cursor pops out, and I'm going to put it where I want to start reading and let go.
He took his chance when the city was captured following a debilitating siege. In one of the most dramatic standoffs of the age, he was confronted in the Basilica of St. Peter in Antioch and challenged to defend his refusal to hand the city over to the Byzantine emperor as promised.
How cool is that? I've always found that being able to listen while looking at a text has helped me to process and retain the information within that text. And of course, I know that everybody is different, and certainly people with dyslexia are not all the same. But I did want to share that while using the OrCam Read, that's something that I have found to be really working for me. Also, as I mentioned previously, the OrCam Read works for texts that are on both the page and the screen. And that is something else that I really love about this. It was so helpful as I researched for this video, and I have no doubt that the OrCam Read will continue to be a great asset for me for my future videos, because whether I was consulting with the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography on my laptop, or checking out relevant articles from JSTOR that I downloaded onto my tablet, I could use this to streamline and speed up my ability to research, which, when you are creating a video a week, is so incredibly useful. I am truly grateful to have received the OrCam Read. I'm going to leave a link to a website where you can find out more about the OrCam Read. But in the meantime, as this is clearly going to become a fixture of my day-to-day life, and equally as we in my household are firm believers of naming everything, whether those things are animate or otherwise, we felt it necessary to provide the OrCam Read with its own name for our house. And we wanted to honour the legacy of that great professional reader, Gabriel Harvey. But we did think that calling something else in this house Gabriel might get confusing. So, as a compromise, please meet the OrCam Read for my house, Harvey. But what do you think of today's look at the ideas of literacy and education from history? Is it what you expected it would be? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video, or you can find me on social media. I'll leave the links to the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Follow me over on some or all of them so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with some friends? Please also let me know you liked it by hitting the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel, and if you hit the bell icon beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down menu, then YouTube will tell you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye bye for now.